Hello everyone! Today's gonna be a very short video on framing responses. For the purposes of this video, framing means explaining the importance of a particular idea. In this case, what I want to be talking about is how to explain the importance of the responses that you may launch in a speech. Oftentimes, you might enter a debate thinking that you should just respond for response's sake. But I would hope that by the end of this video, you can learn to be more purposeful with response selection and execution so that you can increase your chances of winning the round accordingly. The main learning is to practice by incorporating framing into every step of your typical response structure. Commonly, there are 3 steps here. Pointing out the argument that you want to respond to, which is otherwise called flagging the argument, specifying the response that you have to that particular point, and then concluding with the implications of this response to the entirety of their case. Some people think that you should only add in framing at the end of the response, but really you can do it anywhere in your analysis and speech. The first step is to frame the opponent's point in a way that primes it for your eventual response. In other words, you want to re-explain the argument of the opposing team in their words, but in specific terms that make it translatable for your response. For example, if it were a classic "this house believes that social media has done more harm than good" motion, and you were responding to an argument from the opposition that states that social media has been a force for good because it has allowed several protest movements to arise in the world, and then they merely provide an example of one social movement that arose online, you have the typical option to just dismiss this argument as being dependent on the example and then moving on, or you can take this opportunity to introduce this argument as follows. This is the priming part, the framing part of the introduction. The opposition's argument is on how social media has been a platform for protest movements to arise. They point out one example of a successful protest movement, but really what they are saying is that the aggregation of critical mass on social media is effective in getting virality and traction for protest. So now, you have isolated what you specifically want to respond to, and you've even built their argument up in a very charitable way, but still in a way that makes it much easier for you to directly spin and play around with. So here, you are implicitly pointing out that this argument is only important insofar as it relies on this specific mechanism, and so you have something concrete to respond to. Second, now you have to deliver your response and explain why it is specifically important. Let's use the same example earlier of the social media and protest movement argument. Now, you might choose to respond in the following manner. The mechanism of virality may contribute to the formation of strongly felt sentiments that spur up protest movements, but oftentimes it is this same mechanism that allows for these movements to be informed by clickbait, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and fake news online. And this is further reinforced within these echo chambers. So actually, in a vast majority of circumstances, this undermines a lot of protest movements by allowing social media to poison these groups with misinformation at the expense of legitimate on-the-ground concerns of their members. That's the response. So now, you want to work on framing why this is important. This is important because if opposition also meaningfully supports the existence of protest movements as a means to check and balance authoritarian forces in the world, then this response proves that social media itself stagnates these same social movements by sowing more polarization, more disagreement, and more misinformation than what would have otherwise existed without social media. And this is all because of the underlying mechanism that makes some social movements popular. So we have effectively spun their own argument against them. Lastly, you want to explain the implications of this response to the entirety of their case. We're not even done yet. The simple question here is, now that you have responded to this specific point of this specific argument, what is the bigger picture? How does this affect other existing arguments or points in the debate? How does this affect your chances of winning? Let's use the same example. Now that we have established that social movements were only propped up because of this virality and critical mass mechanism, and are, in fact, weakened as a consequence of these, we can say that this mechanism further supports other arguments that we may also forward on the government side. That people lose more and more trust on social media, and thus also on these social movements. That it makes people more disengaged from these discussions, and that even on the best versions of social media for opposition, this virality mechanism divides more than it unifies certain groups. So opposition must now contend with the idea that social media creates a more fragmented world and one where information is more difficult to sift through and process than it otherwise would have been. If you notice, with this framing, the framing of the implications of this response, is that what I'm doing is using this virality mechanism as an opportunity to leverage the context of this debate, the broader context of this debate, which is a context of polarized discourse, and then using this as the fuel for our response. Since now, opposition not only has to deal with social movements that are weak, but one where social movements can't even be appreciated because social media structurally harms this process too. So framing implications is an amazing technique to connect different arguments with one another and play with other characterizations in the context so that you can build up your case more and more. So again, we're not just responding for response's sake. We are using framing as an opportunity to leverage our entire case at the expense of the other teams. All right, that's it for today's video. This was definitely a very short one. Thank you everyone and have a great day. Goodbye.